Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Mary Zimmerman. Dr. Zimmerman is a professor of performance studies at Northwestern University. She's a writer and director of theater specializing in the adaptation of classic stories of world literature. And she's won a Tony, an Obie, and Drama Desk Awards for her work Metamorphoses. Her published plays are seen annually at hundreds of amateur productions around the world, and she's here today to discuss her latest work, The Steadfast Tin Soldier, which is playing at the Looking Glass Theater in Chicago. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Let's talk about The Steadfast Tin Soldier.
The Steadfast Tin Soldier is a little play. It's a sort of holiday show. It's based on a Hans Christian Andersen story by the same name. And one of the things that's interesting about it is, Andersen mostly was reporting on tales that already existed, but Steadfast Tin Soldier, they think, is original with him. And it's a little story, it's a kind of miniature epic about a tin soldier that is made by accident with only one leg, and all of the adventures that befall him when he is sort of thrown out the window by an evil jack-in-the-box. But the particular thing about the show is that no one in it speaks. There's no dialogue whatsoever. It's performed entirely visually. There are 5 actors, and then there's a little orchestra.
Wait, so 5 mimes is what you're saying then? What?
They don't exactly mime because there's thousands and thousands of props. They don't have to pretend nothing's there.
I see.
And there's
okay.
ever-changing sort of old-fashioned painted scenery and little footlights. And then there's 4 musicians with little candles flickering in their music stands. So it's accompanied all the time by music. And sometimes you're right. There's sort of elements of mime when 2 characters are sort of talking to each other. Yeah. But mostly we're witnessing it just sort of unfold.
Did you consider putting some dialogue in it?
Well, I did. When I read it, I was looking for something sort of for all ages and possibly to be a holiday show. And when I came across it, I really, really loved it. It's kind of funny. It's also very moving. And I just thought I could make something of it. But it had only 2 lines of spoken dialogue in it. And usually
Can you tell us the lines, or would that give something away? I don't want to ruin the plot here. Spoiler alert, everybody.
Well, one of the lines does make it into the show, but it's done in a written form.
Wait, there are only 2 lines and you left one out?
I think so.
You're a true artist.
Well, I mean, they're spoken in a kind of written way, in a kind of clever way. One line is spelled out by like little children's letter blocks that keep being rotated to spell out this phrase. Yeah. And that phrase was, he thought that it would be undignified to cry out, and so they did not find him, which is a line I loved of narration. And the other is a spoken line, which the Goblin very meanly says to the tin soldier, "You must not want what you cannot have." And that is written individually on little like magic scarves that come from his mouth, 1 word at a time. But when you're looking for something to adapt, you often are looking for something that's a lot in the dramatic mode. That, in other words, people are talking to each other and it slips very easily into a scene on stage. And although I loved the story, there was virtually no dialogue. It was all narration. And I thought, well, how am I going to get the narration in? I don't really want a narrator. I don't want to create extra scenes of talking for exposition. And then I just thought, why? It has so little talking, why not have none? And that was the challenge I set for myself. I actually kind of like to have a challenge for my shows sometimes.
So one of your motivations is to make it a puzzle for yourself and make it a little bit harder.
A little bit.
Okay.
I mean, I've set things in a pool of water, and I've set things in an old mansion. I've set things we had like a warehouse on 3 flights of a warehouse that 2 different or 3 different audiences were moving through at the same time. So there's often something kind of difficult, not always, but sometimes. So it most resembles to me like a Warner Brothers cartoon that doesn't have any dialogue, or perhaps a silent movie, because there's constantly music, constantly live played, but there's just and there's action galore, but there's just no talking.
And is this something for any age?
It is absolutely, and one thing about it that I'm really proud of is you don't have to speak English to come to it. And every night we have, I think, Russians, Ukrainians, Polish, Spanish speakers in the audience. You hear them in the lobby. And one of the things I'm actually very proud of is a little piece of tape. A friend of the theater brought their grandmother who has a bit of Alzheimer's. but she loved the show and could totally follow it because it is visual. It's not relying on language.
So what are some story elements that you carry on visually? How do you do that?
Well, for instance, one of the problems is how do you do toys, but then they go into the real world. So sometimes the Tin Soldier is played by an actor, sometimes he's a prop about 18 inches big, and sometimes he's a little toy soldier about 8 inches big. And we constantly, when he's 18 inches big, he's played with by a giant puppet of a doll where the head is probably 7 feet big or something. But then later we see that same character, that little child, as a puppet that's just a 2-year-old being manipulated by adults. So the scale keeps shifting. But for instance, at one point, some sort of mischievous boys build a paper boat for him, and he gets trapped in a storm and sent down into the sewer. So we have a little tiny tin soldier put in a paper boat, and then it is pulled sort of magically, tips off the stage into the orchestra pit. And then we see the little small boat falling by someone just carrying it. Then we see the hat of the tin soldier falling by someone carrying it. And then we see the full-sized actor tin soldier whose body is being manipulated to tumble head over heels across the stage. And then when we find him again in the paper boat, now the paper boat is sort of life-size, or it's like 5 feet big, and then a giant rat appears, but we've seen the rat prior be a very small puppet, and then he's a full-bodied actor with a rat's head on his face. So we keep shifting the scale. That's a trick of the show.
That's
constantly.
Very interesting. You know, you're really doing what film does all the time, right? You get a close-up and you get a distance shot. Did you have that in mind at all?
I kind of did, and with my students I use that vocabulary precisely. How in the theater, where there's a fixed distance between the audience member and the stage, do you create a close-up, create a long shot, create a medium shot, and direct focus? I did kind of think in those terms, actually.
I have never seen that done on stage. Is there a tradition of doing that you're aware of? Or?
Well, I'm sure there is. I mean, I've used little miniature boats in almost every production I've done
really?
Because they all contain
sea
voyages. Yeah. So for instance, you have the goddess Athena, you know, carrying the boat with Odysseus and his sailors in her hands, and then Poseidon upsets it and falls on the ground. You know, you shift the scale, and audiences delight in that. They delight in understanding it. They know what's going on, and it kind of unites the audience because they all have this core of experience of playing as children and doing the same thing that they draw upon, and it kind of draws us together, I think.
Yeah, you know, to use a rhetoric term, there's an enthematical element to this then, because you sort of figured out how to tell the story without dialogue.
Yeah.
And the audience has to figure out how to follow the story without dialogue, right? And so they're more cognitively involved in this, aren't they?
Yes, they are. And you know, when we watch a play, and I love plays, but you're attending to the language, and it kind of colonizes your mind. Your mind, like when you read, is occupied with the words that are being spoken. Here, your mind is unoccupied, and you can be more associative. And I also think it returns the audience to the state of being young when you're pre-verbal, and you're very good at figuring out the world just by watching because you don't understand language yet. Yeah. And I think it's very emotional, and people are very emotional when they watch the piece, actually.
So you have an interest in bringing things out of classical literature and putting them on the stage. Why do you do that? What drives you to?
You know, I think I'm just harvesting everything that obsessed me in childhood. I read the Odyssey and the Argonautica when I was a kid, and fairy tales and all those things. But what unites those things is that they were all originally oral. Even if the Odyssey comes down to us as having been written by Homer, the story predates. And I feel like some people think these are not obvious choices for the theater. I think they're very obvious choices for the theater because they were oral performances originally, albeit probably by one storyteller. But they belong to the air. They belong in public listening. So to me, that orality of them draws me, and then the scope of the adventures. Like I said, sea battles, adventures, monsters, transformations, things like that.
Well, it seems to me that things that have been handed down orally they get a kind of polish. They're like a stone that's been in
Yep.
the river for a long time,
Yeah.
right? It's molded by
Yep.
being retold and refigured and stuff.
Absolutely, and it changes with each retelling.
Yeah.
And even though they're great classics, I don't really feel intimidated because I'm participating in this chorus of voices that's gone on for millennia. You know, I'm just one more stepping in with this story for a brief time and then inflecting that
Yeah.
song, but then I step out again. So I don't feel like I'm making any kind of ultimate version of anything.
Yeah.
You know, and it's the tradition in oral storytelling to make it your own. And then I think it's also true that these old tales, they're around not as a conspiracy of English professors, but because they still mean something to people and tend to have quite profound thought in them, as well as being dazzling adventures.
Yeah, in poetry, I think of Sir Patrick Spence as an example of that.
Yeah.
Those lines have just been, retold so many times. By the time it got written down, it really had a very smooth, easy flow to it.
Yes, yes.
And that's a good example. So Hans Christian Andersen was, the point of those stories was to kind of salvage things that were being
Yes.
told orally, right?
Yes.
So, really, you're sort of doing the same thing, right here? I mean, he sort of handed them off to you, and you're handing them off to us, don't you
I
think?
guess so. I mean, like
Yeah.
I say, I do consider myself part of that tradition. And, they except for, Tin Soldier maybe was conceived by him.
Yeah.
But for the most part, like the Grimm's brothers, he
Yeah.
was a sort of ethnographer, collecting stories and preserving
Yeah.
them and saving them.
Yeah.
Adding his own voice,
So
of
this
course.
production you're doing right now sounds like it was fairly expensive, as productions go.
The Looking Glass Theater Company is not a huge enterprise, but we certainly get bang for our buck. It's just so colorful. The costumes are so crazy. They're so exaggerated. It's not realism,
Yeah.
And the proscenium arch, which we manufactured, has like little painted scenes from the story around it. And like I said, we have all this two-dimensional, very, very traditional painted scenery of
Yeah.
like a street and so forth. And
Yeah.
all of that old-fashionedness delights me. But the stage is quite small. It's only 12 feet deep, and I think about 20 feet wide. It's like a bedroom, like a
Yeah.
generous bedroom.
A little puppet display.
Yeah,
almost,
it's
right?
like a little toys theater, but with
Yeah.
life size. And by the way, actors in their 40s and 50s, which I think gives it gravitas and honors childhood narrative and childhood imagination. It's not 25-year-old actors. It's like the creme de la creme of Chicago theater in this thing.
Yeah.
And they are geniuses in it. They're expressive geniuses, in my opinion.
And you had a work, Metamorphoses, that
Yes.
started in Chicago, went to Broadway,
Yes.
right, and was recognized and awarded.
Yes.
How did that change your career? Did it make it possible for you to maybe experiment a little bit more and give you a little more leeway to do new things?
For sure, but it itself was, staged in a pool of water, which was a difficult thing and
Another challenge that
unique
you created for
kind
yourself,
of thing.
right?
Yeah, which it was first done at Northwestern, and in a way, our space there, I think it's called the Barber Theater, suggested it because it slopes down to this sort of pit, which actually, when the stage is out of it, has a little drain at the bottom of it, and it just suggested a pool of water to me. And I think Greek myths and the idea of metamorphoses or change belongs to the water very much. Water's used in rituals of change and transformation, and just in real life, if you put an object in the water, it will be corrupted and it will undergo a sea change, as Shakespeare says. It will be purified or it will be corrupted in some way.
Yeah.
Water is a very influential element. And to have it in the theater it's very beautiful. It's not pretend, it's real. It's not representing water, it actually is water. But definitely that going through New York, it was my first published play.
And you were teaching at Northwestern
I
at this
was,
point,
very
right?
much.
So this in a way interrupted your academic career.
It didn't interrupt
right?
it, I just kept going, and it had a student cast, and 3 of those original cast members were with it through its whole journey from a school play.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah, to professional in Chicago, to going around the country, to being off Broadway and then on Broadway. 3 of the original cast were in it.
And that's a
through the
period
whole
of a
thing.
few years, obviously.
It was. It was several years, actually. And we were never, when I put it on at school in a million years, I didn't think, and we're headed to Broadway. That was all like what would happen in a movie. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it did happen.
Yeah, some friends of mine and I worked on sets for the Grease production in Chicago, which also started in Chicago, and we had no idea this was going to become a movie or anything.
It's lovely, isn't it?
It's nice when that happens.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So what else have you been working on here? I know 2 years ago.
Yeah, well, one thing that's happened in the last few years is I have started to direct opera, which is a surprise to me. And a couple years ago, I did an opera based on the myth of Eurydice, but it wasn't my libretto. It was Sarah Ruhl's, a very famous playwright who wrote a very famous play called Eurydice, which, similarly to my work, takes an ancient myth and modernizes it in certain ways. So that was my fourth or fifth opera. That was my fifth opera at the Met. And then I'm doing one in about a year. It will open, but it has not yet been announced, so I will not say what that is. But that's the next thing that's in my head, is set design for that and conceiving how to stage that.
How's that differ from just doing a play?
It is so different. I love the question, what's the difference directing between theater and opera? It's night and day. Opera looks like the theater in lots of ways, but it isn't. And one of the chief ways in which it's different, believe it or not, is the audience. Because the audience in opera so often knows the text inside and out. And they have very strong ideas about it, and they come in with certain expectations and knowledge. Whereas in the theater, we're prepared for it to be new all the time. Even if it's Chekhov or Shakespeare, we're very prepared.
You expect to be surprised.
Right? But there's a history and a weight of history in directing opera. And then just in terms of the singers, they're on these world stages because they're one of a few dozen people that have a voice beautiful and accurate enough, but also big enough to fill those houses unmiked. But it doesn't mean that they have any affinity for acting or being on the stage. And their task is so different. They're not as free as an actor. They can't deviate from the key or the tempo of the orchestra, right?
So how do you direct someone like that?
Well, I always say that the chief thing that you have to try and do is prevent them from being like a silent film actor, because paradoxically, they're a little bit robbed of their voice. Their voice is occupied 100% by the score, and it's kind of not in their control what note they're supposed to sing next and at what pace. Unlike the actor who can approach a line differently night after night after night, even stop the show with a pause or something. Opera singers, they get on that horse and they have to go. And it can paradoxically sever them from their bodies, and they become weirdly overexpressive with their bodies, like a silent movie actor. All that kind of melodramatic gesture. So you try to get them off of that. You try to get them to look at the person they're addressing. You're 50% there.
So basically, you're dealing with singers and trying to get them to be actors, right?
On the other hand, they're sometimes very expressive, and I'm not saying they're not very game. They always are, in my experience. But their task is really, really tough up there in a way that I did not appreciate. When I would say it wasn't until my second or third opera maybe that I began to understand how difficult what they're doing is. And if they don't move when you told them to and where you told them to, it's because every atom of their being is concentrating on hitting those notes that are very difficult and under very difficult circumstances. So I have nothing but love now and appreciation for opera singers. Though at first I was frustrated by them because I was used to actors,
Yeah, I know. Those of us who play guitar have trouble playing and singing at the same time, so I can appreciate the problem.
They say it's like, there's a saying in opera, you're running a marathon, solving a math problem, and singing in a foreign language.
All at the same time.
Yeah.
Well, so if you're directing an opera, what makes you feel good? What makes you feel like you really accomplished something?
Oh gosh, when opera always has this promise of being like the total theater, I tend to think actually music is dominating it and playing a heavier hand. But when it works, and the music is so beautiful and the singer is so involved with it, and you've created a beautiful setting for it, it is transporting. It is fantastic. And also, audience operas cheer in the middle of things. And when that happens, it's like a football stadium. You know, the Met seats 3,800. And when they go nuts, you know, you just feel that you've helped create a tremendous pleasure for people.
You get the reward at the end of every production with the applause of the audience, right? And
yes,
you
although
know if
I
it
have
worked or
been
not.
booed.
Yeah.
I have been booed on the stage
Really?
at Met. I have to own up to that. Yeah, I have.
For
So it was an opera called La Sonnambula, which I took a very different, I actually think it was quite a truthful approach, but I set it in contemporary times in a kind of meta way that was not beloved. Although I have to say, I think it might be my favorite of my productions there. I stand by it. I think it really worked.
well, so the audience didn't get it. What do you
They
think?
just didn't want to see it that way. You know, with opera, that's what I'm talking about. The audience has certain knowledges
Yeah.
and expectations. The second time we did it, a year later, it was, you know, then they were used to it. The shock of it was over, and they were appreciative of it and liked it.
It seemed to me that when you did Eurydice, it had some different plot shifts in it.
Yes.
The fact that Orpheus is more concerned with other things maybe than he is with his
Yes.
marriage, and
With music, yes.
you know, there was some twists.
Yes.
Did that attract you to it, or did
Very,
you see that
very
as a problem
much.
you had to deal with?
No, very, very much. And in fact, Sarah's Rule's big twist is that when Eurydice gets to the underworld, and this is so moving, she meets her father, who
Yeah.
died early. And, you know, the story of Eurydice and Orpheus, it's a story of the near miss, right? Like they're almost
Maybe we should
out from
talk
the-
about the background of this. So Orpheus is kind of considered patron god of the arts,
Of
right?
music in
Of music,
particular,
yeah.
yeah.
And Eurydice is this woman that he falls in love
Yes.
with, and she's bit by an asp or something,
Yes.
a deadly snake.
At their wedding.
At their wedding, and dies.
Yes.
And he is such a wonderful musician that he goes into Hades and convinces the powers that be to let her come back under the requirement that he not look at her as their.
Yes.
This is sort
She's
of like
following behind, and it's not supposed to turn around.
yeah. This is sort of like the story of Sodom and Gomorrah with
Yes,
yeah,
Don't Look
with
Back,
Lot's
yeah.
wife, yeah.
Uh-huh.
So and Dylan said that too, of course,
Yeah,
right? But-
yeah.
So he in the mythical story, he looks back
Yes.
on his own.
Yes.
And loses her. She's
Yes.
taken back, right?
Yes.
But in the story that you did, the one that which is in your script, but
Right.
but the one that you chose, she wants to stay in Hades, right? And so
Well-
she calls his name and tricks him into turning back so she can stay.
Oh,
Is that
it's
right? No?
impulsive. She doesn't want to stay.
Yeah.
However, there might be an unconscious impulse in her because she is leaving her father, but none of
Yeah.
us ever thought she explicitly wanted that. But you know, Orpheus and Eurydice is the story of a near miss, right? It's like, oh, they're right at the threshold, but he
Right.
turns.
I hate
And what
stories like that.
Sarah doubles that, because as Eurydice goes and follows Orpheus away, we have a scene with the abandoned father in the underworld, and he's so sad that he sort of commits a kind of suicide. Her vision of the underworld is that you're dipped in the water and you can no longer speak. And the father had escaped that, but he voluntarily erases his memory. Then, unbeknownst to him, you know, Eurydice is sent back because Orpheus turned around, and she's looking for her father, and she finds she just misses him because he thinks she's
Yeah.
gone now forever.
This is Romeo and
Then-
Juliet too, right?
So
Yeah.
then she does the same thing. She dips herself in the river, and at that moment, Orpheus arrives in the underworld for good, meaning he's either killed himself or it's years later and he's dead, and he just misses her. So it's not one near miss, it's three.
Yeah.
It's really profound and extremely dark and sad.
So, viewers, if you liked Von Ryan's Express and you liked Romeo and Juliet, we've got a
Yes.
triple disappointment for you
Yes,
in Eurydice, right?
but still beautifully sung and beautifully composed, yeah.
Yeah, Frank Sinatra in Von Ryan's Express manages to escape, and as he's running for the train, sorry.
Yeah.
I'm giving it away.
You're
yeah.
spoiled. Well, it doesn't matter.
Probably
I think
nobody
I now
watches
know
it
what it
anymore.
is.
Yeah. Okay. So, and so, what else? What else is coming up for you? What are you thinking about?
Well, we have a new artistic director at the Goodman Theater where I'm also affiliated, and I will probably do something next year, but I kind of have no idea what. So the upcoming opera at the Met, and I have this other show called The Notebooks of Leonardo da Vinci, which I first did over 20 years ago and then recently revived at the Goodman last spring. And then this fall it was in Washington, D.C., and in January it goes to the Old Globe in San Diego. And that, the challenge of that is the entire script is just Leonardo's writings and nothing else. Like there's no plot really or scenes. It's just his writings.
A narrator reading from the notebook?
Well, there's 8 of them. They're all Leonardo, and they don't read, and we sort of demonstrate or counter-demonstrate the ideas about painting and weight. It's very physical, it's very visual. The set is floor-to-ceiling wooden file cabinets out of which come everything in the world. And that's an old show of mine. In fact, the first time I ever did it, I was still in graduate school, just with myself and friends and no set.
Oh. Interesting. That's all the time we have right now for our program. Thank you to Dr. Mary Zimmerman for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. I'll see you next time.